dominance or its exclusionary practices than it was the advent of regulation. You couldn't say honestly that the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910 was hostile to competition. The Act is entirely silent on the question, and there is no legislative history. But the advent of regulation reflected a growing view that the telecommunications industry was naturally monopolistic, and that competition was neither sustainable nor efficient. That paradigm lasted until roughly the late 1960s, when intrepid competitors sought entry into private line service and peripheral equipment markets. It was a very modest beginning for competition, but it soon proved to be the proverbial camel's nose under AT&T's Big Ten. By the late 1970s, competitive entry had been extended into the basic switched long-distance service markets and basic equipment markets. So competition seemed to be on the march. However, although competition was on the march, everyone at the time expected that it would be limited. That is to say, no one at the time doubted that there was still a core part of the telecommunications industry that was naturally monopolistic. In 1984, when the Bell system was broken up in order to make the telecommunications world safe for competition, in fact, there was no idea at the time by the Justice Department or anybody else of introducing competition into local service markets. Those were deemed to be still naturally monopolistic. In the ensuing years after the breakup, things changed a little bit. There was a little bit of competition in local markets, and it was at least enough to suggest the possibility that maybe the natural monopoly paradigm wasn't applicable. In 1996, Congress officially retired the paradigm by enacting the Telecommunications Act of 1996, declaring competition to be hands down the national policy for all telecommunications services, equipments, everything. To say that the paradigm was retired in 1996 is not to say that monopoly itself ended. In fact, at that time, some markets were fully competitive, others were becoming so, but local exchange service markets are still struggling to become competitive. It's fair to say that although there's been some progress there, the progress has been rather more sedulous than Congress expected in 1996. Indeed, the meltdown of competitive local exchange carriers in the period 2000-2002 suggested to some that the market opening provisions of the 1996 Act created a market for bankruptcy lawyers, more competition in the market for bankruptcy lawyers than in the telecommunications market. Well, at least the slow development has suggested to some that maybe the game plan that Congress envisioned in 1996 that the FCC began to implement was amiss. There was something wrong with it. There are a number of competing explanations for what that something might be. It would require too long a detour to even summarize some of the competing views. It's enough to say that competition in local service markets is still a work in progress. Interestingly, though, it is progressing in ways that are somewhat orthogonal to the ways that the Congress contemplated, and indeed somewhat orthogonal to the ways that the FCC originally contemplated. Okay, so far all I've related is factual history. The story is interesting, but is it also instructive? Are there any lessons to be derived from it? There are, I think, at least 3 lessons. There's that magic number again, that one might take away from this history. The first is really takes the form of a set of questions about how paradigms arise and how they are defined and how they fit with regulation. Today, virtually everyone regards the demise of the natural monopoly model as correct. That is to say, there are some doubts about whether or not competition has been fully effective, but almost no one doubts that competition is the right model. Now, this raises an interesting question. What exactly caused the shifting, the passing of the paradigm? Was it a change in the markets? Was it a change in technology? Was it a change in the character of economic science? Or what? Which is really a way of asking, how did we get the natural monopoly model in the first place? A market, as you undoubtedly know, is deemed to be naturally monopolistic when it is characterized by economies of scale such that a single firm can effectively and most efficiently serve the entire market. In such a case, competition is not sustainable and not efficient. In the heyday of the Bell monopoly, this was widely believed to be true of the entire domain of the Bell system, particularly the service markets. But the empirical basis for that was not at all clear. After all, as I just related, we had 20 years of competition. So there wasn't any empirical validation of the natural monopoly model at that time. In fact, in 1910, when the Mann-Elkins Act was enacted, there were almost as many subscribers to the independent carriers as there was to the Bell system. And even if one could reasonably be certain from pure theoretical grounds and expectations about the future that this competition was not sustainable, why would one want to anticipate the outcome by foregoing the possibility of competition? Why not allow competition to run its course? If it's inevitable that it'll fail, fine, but at least allow competitors or consumers to have the benefit of competition while it lasts. Well, one common explanation for that is that if competition isn't sustainable, we want to avoid wasted investment in competitive facilities. In the early competitive era, there were markets in which we had duplicate lines, duplicate telephone poles running down opposite sides of the street. What a waste, right? On the other hand, I mean, we have lots of street corners with 2 or 3 gas stations on different parts of the corner. We have lots of markets where there are 2 or 3 grocery stores in the same vicinity, maybe even the same shopping mall. What a waste, right? Well, it's true, duplicate lines are messy, they're unsightly. And of course, you could always require that they be put on the ground, which is where they belong anyway. All of which is a way of saying, suggesting at least, that this early embrace of natural monopoly was deeply problematic in ways that didn't even occur to anybody until the late 1970s. And then the idea was, well, things have changed. But exactly what had changed? A second lesson to be derived from the story is the ease with which paradigms can be expanded beyond their original parameters. Even accepting the common belief at the time that core service markets were naturally monopolistic, there never was any credible factual or theoretical basis for treating equipment markets that way. And yet, in its heyday, AT&T not only controlled all service markets, or dominated all service markets, it also dominated all equipment markets. Network equipment, consumer premises equipment, peripheral equipment. It even had a monopoly of telephone directories. Nobody worth listening to would believe that those things were naturally monopolistic. Well, that was justified by a different theory. We had to sort of drag in another theory, totally irrelevant to the natural monopoly theory, which was it was necessary in order to protect the integrity of the network to give AT&T control over all these equipment, equipment. Well, that theory turned out to be even more infirm and insubstantial than the natural monopoly theory. It doesn't require control, does not require monopoly. All it requires is the adoption of equipment interconnection standards to ensure that the equipment doesn't harm the network. But it took about a half century to recognize that seemingly simple and now blindingly obvious solution. A third lesson from the story is not about natural monopoly or economic theory, but about the ways of regulation. Regulation was originally justified by treating this as a monopoly, so when it was no longer a monopoly, it followed that we don't need regulation, right? Wrong. Regulation wasn't abandoned when the monopoly paradigm was abandoned, it was simply repurposed. Regulation originally, of course, was to protect consumers against monopolists. Then it was repurposed to protect competitors against the monopolists. Now, of course, this repurposed regulation, in theory, should disappear once competition becomes effectively established. Students of regulation, at least those who attend the School of Public Choice, will not be surprised to learn that this has not yet happened. To be sure, there have been many markets that have been duly regulated. The FCC deserves lots of credit in that regard. We have deregulated equipment supply, we've deregulated wireless to a substantial degree. And yet, regulation as an overall activity has not diminished. By every measure, the amount of regulatory energy in this mighty Mississippi has increased. Go figure. Now, the regulation is different in kind, as I said, but it continues. The word exchange with melody lingers on. So, the big idea that stands out here is that regulation can be impervious to changes in the underlying basis, the underlying models or paradigms that support them initially. You might even say that regulation has become its own paradigm. That's a segue of sorts into my second story. My second story is about self-defining regulation. I like to call this regulatory parthenogenesis. Here's Webster's definition of parthenogenesis. It is the reproduction by development of an unfertilized, usually female gamete that occurs especially among lower plants and invertebrate animals. It probably appears gratuitously insulting for me to imply that the FCC is a lower plant or invertebrate, but I'm sure that's not my intended meaning. I only mean to suggest that this refers to the ability of regulation to reproduce without outside help. And if you want to continue the biology metaphor, you might say, you might define outside help to mean without legislative insemination. That too has some awkward connotations. I hasten to add, it's not unusual to have law without legislation. The common law is parthenogenetic, a self-defining process by which courts create law and change to conform to the conditions that they confront over time. Ultimately, of course, the courts do derive their basic charter, their basic jurisdiction from legislation. But once established, the courts basically go of themselves. They create law, they create their own jurisdiction to some extent. Some regulatory agencies are like that. This is the model, the so-called New Deal model of regulation, of which the 1934 Communications Act is often cited as a primary example. In the New Deal model, agencies are given broad and amorphous power, discretionary power to basically find a need and fill it, as the old advertisement used to put it. And that's exactly what the FCC has done over the years, find needs and fill them. Now, it's true that the New Deal model has changed a lot. In fact, the New Deal model has given way in modern times, in almost every regulatory area, to a model of rather more specific statutory directions. The 1996 Telecommunications Act, for example, is really quite specific in many respects, and not at all of the same model and mode as the 1934 Act. What's interesting, however, is that time and time again, the FCC still finds itself going back to the 1934 Act, still finds itself creating its own jurisdiction, drawing on that broad delegation of powers. Actually, to say that it draws on that broad delegation is misleading, because it suggests that what the FCC is doing here is deriving